A key question, though, is can this relationship regulation model of moral judgment actually explain the variance that we see in moral judgments about violence? Can the model help us understand why there's disagreement about what constitutes harm and what a serious act of harm is? Indeed, the model predicts that the same intentional harm will be judged morally praiseworthy or acceptable in some relational contexts and blameworthy or unacceptable in other relational contexts. So let's see this play out. In a communal sharing context, intentional harm that's directed at the outgroup is acceptable, especially if it defends the in-group from contamination or threats to their well-being. Directed at the in-group, though, intentional harm is much less acceptable. So the in-group, out-group distinction is what determines whether intentional harm is morally acceptable or not, if we're in the communal sharing context. In an authority ranking context, it's really different. Intentional harm of subordinates can be considered righteous punishment. Intentional harm by subordinates when they're under orders can be considered morally laudable. Here, the authority-subordinate relationship determines whether the harm is morally acceptable. In an equality matching context, intentional harm is justified if it's in response to harm that was previously endured. The eye for an eye structure is straightforward in equality matching. In a market pricing context, how might violence be viewed here? Intentional harm. Intentional harm is always costly, but it's acceptable if the benefits are big enough. Unpacking harm like that by the relational models demonstrates that harm can be viewed through multiple perspectives. As the authors propose, many disagreements regarding the acceptability of violence may be due to different individuals employing different moral motives to determine the criteria upon which moral judgments are made. And they have these different moral motives because they're coming from the perspective of different relational models. So how can we prevent moral disagreement? Similarly to how taking the perspective of these different relational models allows us to see intentional harm in really different ways, we can prevent moral disagreement by recognizing the moral motives of all parties. Opposing parties can be understood by their perspectives and whether they are occupying competing perspectives, rather than as opposition to be condemned. Yes, this is going to be a really hard task. So how can we prevent moral violations then, or find some common ground on this theoretical approach? Ryan Fisk suggests that we should direct our efforts at our social relationships. They describe a close link between moral motives and social contexts. So for example, if we enforce over and over turn-taking and random selection, then equality will just be a moral feature that emerges in our group. And if we introduce communal sharing in the sense of one, then a unity motive should emerge. These are both inconsistent, of course, with the social relationship features of authority ranking, which might emphasize our differences in authority and encourage expression of hierarchy motives. The strength of this model is that it proposes moral judgments are embedded in social relationships, which we do have the power to change and affect. Here's how they put it. Some judgments and behaviors, such as those related to violence towards others and unequal treatment, which we may view as prescriptively immoral and which some have described as resulting from non-moral, selfish, and social biases, can actually reflect genuine moral motives embedded in social relationships. But just because our moral motives that are leading to harmful behavior, for example, are rooted in our relationships and social contexts, this is not to say that we must accept horrific acts because they have a natural and objective basis in human moral psychology. So they're not saying that people get a pass because what they're doing is natural. In fact, they say if some prescriptively evil practices in the world are facilitated by the same moral motives that lead to prescriptively good outcomes, we cannot blind ourselves to this truth, even if the sources are natural. Finally, Ryan Fisk present their work as part of the scientific search for the meaning in moral judgment. They say we may and should assess which moral motives best promote human health, well-being, and peace. But we must understand the moral psychological basis of acts we aim to deter. So you've seen a lot of different theories and ways of approaching moral judgment. At this point, you can decide for yourself and think more on which fits for you.